Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is How Animals Colonized Iceland with NatHab Expedition Leader Lianne Thompson. Thank you so much for being here today, Lianne. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining today. It's a really interesting topic, and I love Iceland. Been guiding there for a few years, so it's exciting to be able to share with you this. And it's quite a fascinating study to have an example of an island for that. My cat is about to join the webinar as well. I think is approaching here. But yeah, before we get started on the whole topic, I'll just kind of introduce myself. So yeah, my name's Lianne Thompson. I currently live in British Columbia. Grew up in Southern Ontario, did a degree in zoology and a master's in conservation education, and started working for NatHab back in 2018. I do a variety of NatHab's programs. Started with the polar bears, do Northern Lights, which I'll be leaving to go and start in like 5 days. Our Northern Lights season is rapidly beginning up in Churchill. Belugas, the Cotswold Strips, Canadian Rockies, Iceland, Greenland. I've been doing Iceland now. This summer, I think, is my 4th year doing it. And I've just fallen so in love with that country. It's just a spectacular place. So when I get the opportunity to talk about it and gush about it for a little while, then I always take it. I am also a photographer. I love taking photos in these places. Most of the photos that are in this presentation are mine. You'll probably be able to tell the next couple slides are not mine because they're geology. We're starting with that. But it's a beautiful country to be able to take photos of. So yeah, we can dive in. This is Odin. This is my cat, and he'll come in and out throughout the duration of the webinar, most likely. To start the conversation, we are going to do a bit of geology, because why is it that the topic of how animals colonized Iceland exists? What makes Iceland different from other areas of the earth? So geology is just going to be a beginning bit. We won't dwell on it too much, but it's important to kind of have that foundation and understanding of why is Iceland the way that it is, in order to understand why we can have the topic of how animals colonized Iceland. So when we look at this, it kind of gives you what the earth is composed of. So we've got our inner core, that ball right in the center there, and then our mantle, which has an inner and an outer mantle, and then we've got obviously our crust, and then the crust is where we will be hanging out in. And so having all of this, it is not a stagnant system, because of the elements that exist, because of the heat transfer, all of these different components. It is a constant moving system, but that's why this is kind of what our Earth is made up of. And because it's that moving system, we have a concept called plate tectonics. And likely many people are quite familiar with this. Kind of the general view that our world is divided into different plates, and that these plates are moving around. And when people think of plate tectonics, oftentimes they can think of the supercontinent of Pangaea. So Pangaea, it was the last time that all of our continents on Earth were all kind of together as one. And as the plates continue to move around, it has split into the current orientation of our continents. So you've got the before, during Pangaea, and then after of what we look like now. And when our plates are moving around, of course, they can interact in various different ways. So on the right-hand side of the screen, there's 3 different ways that we can see this. So there is a convergent plate boundary, and so that is when 2 plates are coming together and they can smash into each other. Underneath that, we've got a divergent plate boundary, and this means that the 2 plates are moving away from each other. And then you have the third one, which is transform. Sometimes people will call it a passive plate boundary, and it's when they're kind of sliding next to each other. And so these are all the ways in which our plates are moving throughout on Earth. And when we talk about Iceland specifically, we look at one of them, and that is that divergent plate boundary. So where Iceland is, it is moving away from each other. And if that seems quite strange, the next slide hopefully can help things make a little bit more sense, because here is a rough map of what the different plates that exist on Earth. And if you're good at looking at maps, so you can maybe see exactly where Iceland is. If you're not, don't worry, I've circled it there for you. So we've got Iceland up there at the very top, and you'll notice that there is this whole ridge line that's coming down. So Iceland sits directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge. And this mid-Atlantic ridge is about 40,000 miles long. So mainly it's along the ocean floor. But because it's that divergent plate boundary, it's moving in opposite directions. And it's estimated that that divergent plate boundary is actually separating from each other at a rate of about 2.5 centimeters per year. And so along the mid-Atlantic ridge, but along the ocean floor, there is actually going to be big mountain ranges right along that ocean floor. And if we zoom in a little bit more on just what Iceland is, so again, that line going through is that mid-Atlantic ridge. It means we have the North American plate and the Eurasian plate, and they're moving in opposite directions. And so this is not something that's unique just to Iceland. Obviously, if we look at all of those, the tectonic plate boundaries, there are other areas where things are moving apart. But there's a second factor that's really important for Iceland to be Iceland for it to exist the way that it does. So the first component is that mid-Atlantic ridge, but the second component is a mantle plume, sometimes called a hotspot. And so the hotspot is kind of the general theory behind that is, go back into our plate tectonics and the convergent plate boundaries, when two plates kind of smash into each other, we get a lot of mountain formations, but we'll end up having one that goes underneath and one that goes over top because they're going to weigh different amounts. And so when we've got these convergent plate boundaries and these tectonic plates kind of smashing into it, a piece of it is going to be subducted, will go underneath, and then that can fall down into our mantle, into the core of the Earth. Again, going back to that first slide of what the components of our Earth look like. And this creates kind of a concentration of minerals and radioactive decay and heat. And so at the core with this, it then sends things right back up up through the mantle and up to our crust. And so we get this mantle plume, this hot spot, and it's a big magma plume. And there is one directly underneath Iceland. So since we've got our convergent plate boundaries moving away from each other, but we also have this hot spot, it's feeding in and it is producing the island of Iceland. And this isn't the only place where there would be hot spots. Another one that people are often familiar with is Hawaii. So Hawaii also has a hot spot, but because it is on a singular plate, it moves, our plate tectonics are moving, and that's why with that hot spot kind of staying stationary and the tectonic plates moving around, why we end up with a chain of islands. So that's kind of like our core components about how Iceland exists. It requires that mid-Atlantic ridge, it requires that mantle plume or hotspot, and both of those things together create Iceland. And from that, obviously, it creates a lot of volcanic activity. So Iceland, when we talk about our years and how long things have existed, Iceland is a really, really, really young country. So formed through this volcanic activity, the hot spot kind of opening up 20 to 25 million years ago and starting to produce the island of Iceland. And if you remember, I said that the mid-Atlantic ridge is separating at a rate of 2.5 centimeters a year. And so that means that Iceland is doing so as well. But because it's got that mantle plume, Iceland as a country is actually growing by about 2.5 centimeters a year. So it's a really fascinating thing to think that exists. So if we now have a rough idea of why it is that Iceland exists as a country, we then can start talking about how did animals come to be, because it's a different story than all of the other continents. And so at first, we have to start in the water. So our earliest colonizers would have been our marine organisms. So our tiny little things, this is things like planktons and mollusks and crustaceans, all of that just kind of coming over because of the ocean currents that exist in our oceans. And so this likely starting to happen and more establishing themselves 10 to 15 million years ago. And then that brings other creatures, because if we've got nutrients essentially that have moved up and colonizing the waters and the areas around Iceland, then other animals are going to follow as well. So things like our whales. So this is a picture of a humpback whale, and it's taken in the West Fjords of Iceland. And even though it's this massive, massive animal, they are a baleen whale, and they're eating really, really small organisms, and so they will follow the nutrient-rich water. They migrate up to Iceland every single year because they know that that's where the food is going to go. So with the establishment of some of our marine planktons and crustaceans and whatnot, then we have the introduction of whales. We can also have the introduction of other fish, things like Atlantic cod and herring. Those things will be coming up as well. And then you have other species that will follow those as well. So we've got our seal species, for example, because our herring and our cod come up, then it brings all these other animals that are able to happen. And the other thing that's important to talk about is the impact of glaciers. So as our glaciation periods have occurred, glaciers form and retreat and form and retreat. And over Iceland, and the most recent massive glaciation period that we often talk about is about 10,000 years ago. And these glaciers forming and retreating and forming and retreating actually have helped form and shape the island of Iceland. So it's why we have all these different fjords, lagoons, all these coastal habitats that have been created, and we get more things like kelp forests and coral reefs and all these other species coming in. So that's kind of how our marine our waters were populated around. But when we talk about glaciers, this is one of the challenges that would be presented in terms of colonizing the land itself, because the waters kind of make sense, right? Like it's all connected. Things are eventually going to move in and around the area, but it's the land that's the fascinating part of it all. But one of the main challenges of species colonizing the land of Iceland would be our glaciers. So again, those glaciers kind of dominating the land that is Iceland about 10,000 years ago. So again, when we look at like the time frame of things, a very young country. Another challenge to colonization is the volcanic activity. So yes, we had all this volcanic activity that has created the island of Iceland, but that mantle plume exists still. And if you keep up to date with any of the news regarding volcanic activity in Iceland, you'll know that along the peninsula, close to the airport, close to the capital city of Reykjavik, there is a lot of volcanic activity. I will be honest and say that I did not Google what's going on with it right now, but over the last several years, there have been a lot of volcanoes that are opening. Some of them come about for days, hours, minutes, sometimes months, and it's just variable. But we have all of this volcanic activity, and it's creating huge lava fields, and it can contribute to having really nutrient poor soils and make it really difficult for animals to colonize. You have this very hot lava spewing out and destroying ecosystems that already exist in Iceland. But imagine animals trying to colonize this land. It doesn't look overly friendly, does it? So where will we start then? Obviously, volcanic activity still happens, so this is still impacting things. But in general, when we talk about the island of Iceland, much of it is far more established. But how we would have started getting species to come on land in Iceland, it would have started with obviously our plants. They would have been the first core components to it all. And all of this can then start to happen because of the retreat of the glaciers. If the glaciers are covering everything, it makes it really hard for plants to establish, for photosynthesis to be able to happen, for these organisms to go through their reproductive means and spread across the island. So instead, they have to wait until after our glaciation events. And so again, 10,000 years ago, and we would have first started to see the introduction of things like lichens and mosses. So these are our early colonizers. They're able to attach themselves onto pretty much everything. So we've got lichen on the left-hand side there, and then a whole bunch of this woolly fringe moss on the top right photo. And these things can attach onto anything and everything, literally. So they will be starting to establish themselves on this rock. Once the volcanic activity has calmed down in an area, the heat no longer exists, and it becomes an area where something can establish. We start to see our lichens and our mosses. And the picture in the top right-hand corner there It is this whole lava field that we will drive through on the trips that we do in Iceland. And we just go through this massive field, and the whole area is just covered in this woolly fringe moss. And that volcanic activity is only actually a couple of hundred years old. So it can tell you how quickly some of these can establish. And when we've got our lichens and our mosses, what they can end up doing is starting to actually break down some of that rock. So these pioneer species break down the rock and help to create the formation of soil. And when you have soil, you're then able to have other plants, vascular plants, come in and start to establish. Moss is so incredible because it holds a lot of moisture. Because it's breaking things down, it essentially creates a perfect little habitat for seeds to come in and other plants to establish themselves. So our lichens, our mosses, they're coming in, breaking down, making soil, making other organic material, and making way for the arrival of our vascular plants. Now, how will these vascular plants get here? Some of it will be wind, so we get seed dispersal. So seeds, especially, we can have really, really light seeds that are able to just spread across from other countries. Even though Iceland obviously is not right next door to other countries, it is amazing how much seed dispersal can happen from the wind. So that one would be really important, but also birds. Birds, if they've come and migrated from other areas, they come, they land on Iceland, they poop, and they might poop and bring out different seeds. So that will largely be how we are getting the arrival of these vascular plants. And many will come, not all will establish, because though I love Iceland dearly, it's not the easiest place to be all of the time. They have very cold temperatures, they've got wicked winds, tons of rain. It can make it a very inhospitable area to establish. So really, it's kind of the toughest are the ones that survive. But we have the introduction of our vascular plants. And this is still a process that kind of is ongoing now with volcanic activity happening, wiping out areas and allowing kind of the succession of a new ecosystem to come into place, new species being established, the introduction of some very invasive species. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but the lupin that's been introduced into Iceland, if you Google pictures or if you've been there and seen these photos of these beautiful purple fields all across Iceland, it is lupin, and that lupin purposefully introduced. It's a very hardy plant. It's able to establish really well. It is a nitrogen fixer. So in theory, it actually helps to produce land for other plants to come in. But because it's such an invasive species, it kind of chokes out a lot of the other plants that are able to establish. So there's a lot of competition that happens amongst these plants. And you have to imagine, and if you've been there again, or you plan to go there, have a look at the plant species that are there, because the fact that they're able to establish themselves there is pretty incredible. These tiny, tiny little things can be very, very hardy out there. But I spoke about birds. So in order for some of these plants to arrive, yes, wind seed dispersal is part of it, but birds being the other one. So we talk about the arrival of some of our bird species. And this would have happened over time as the ecosystem is modifying and adjusting. So at first it could be the arrival of various migratory birds. So you have all these species that are moving around all over the place. And so one of them would be the raven. So ravens, they have a very wide distribution, and they're really, really good at adapting to a variety of different habitats. So they're blackbirds, so they are able to absorb more of that solar heat, which really benefits them from if they're going to want to live in an area that's very cold. Strong flight capabilities, wide, broad wings, excellent for soaring, and the ability to soar over these very open landscapes would be something that's quite beneficial. Feeding in memory, I could do an entire webinar on just like crows and ravens. I love them so much. So I'm going to try not to go out down that rabbit hole too much right now. But, they're able to eat a whole variety of different foods. They are not picky on what it is that they eat, from berries to seeds to carcasses to like insects, a whole bunch of stuff. They're able to feed on a variety of different things. They have incredible memories. They cache food a lot. So they collect food when the getting's good and hide it in various various areas, and they will remember where they've hidden it, so that throughout the winter, when there are not that many resources, they're able to go back, find all of those individual food caches, and be able to survive a winter when there's hardly any resources available. And being able to remember where you've hidden all your food, that in itself is a pretty remarkable thing. They also have a really strong relationship with humans. They're good at exploiting humans. There are, again, I could do a webinar on this and show you various videos of how it is that they've learned to utilize humans, but they've got a really strong relationship with humans. And there's even the story of Floki, who kind of is the one discovering the island of Iceland. There's talk about Odin, how the Norse god Odin, he would travel with ravens, and that they would use these ravens to discover where land is. Because the theory is if you let your ravens go, if they come back to you, it means that they have not found land. And if they don't return to you, then they have found land. So when Floki was out in the Atlantic waters, had 3 ravens, this is the story of the discovery of Iceland, had 3 ravens, let them go. 2 of them returned, and then 1 did not. So Floki continued going in the direction that that raven had gone, and then he landed on the island of Iceland. So they're written about a whole lot. There's a lot of mythology, talk on the island and in general, but on the island in Iceland as well, about the relationship with these ravens. And of course, many, many years after the Ice Age and 10,000 years ago, much more recently, when humans were able to establish, which we'll get to more later on, ravens were able to flourish even more because of that relationship with humans. You've got all of these cattle, we've got sheep, we've got everything that the humans have now brought with them, and it creates a whole lot of food resources for the ravens. So you're essentially supplementing their diet and really strengthening their ability to flourish on this island. But yeah, a species like raven would be some of the first birds that would come to the area. And then we would have our seabird colonizers. So our fulmars, our puffins, our Arctic terns, our guillemots, all of these species that are coming, they are often these migratory species. All of these birds that are on the screen right now, they're all birds that migrate to Iceland and then they migrate to other areas. But once the island of Iceland is established, once we've got these mosses and these lichens breaking down, you have all of this rugged coastal habitat that actually becomes perfect habitat for nesting grounds. So our seabirds start moving in and wanting to utilize this space. And it's estimated that this time frame would have been 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. But yeah, that kind of establishment of habitat for them to come in and come after that breeding habitat is why they would have ended up coming there. And then we can go and look at our other bird species, some of our kind of more freshwater and wetland birds, grebes and loons, divers is what they'll call them in Iceland, swans. All of these ones would have come a little bit later on, and this is likely due again to the retreat of our glaciers, because as our glaciers retreat and our land rebounds back up from having the weight of the glacier on top of it, it then starts rising back up again. How the water drains out, how the glacial erosion took place and impacted the topography of the island. It creates all of these freshwater ecosystems. We've got glacial rivers, inland lakes, all of these things kind of being produced as the glaciers have retreated. And so because you've got freshwater habitats, it then invites a whole other host of species that can come in. So all these other birds that will capitalize on coming into the area. And then you can't talk about things without talking about insects. So insects, they would have began arriving again also after the last ice age. And they play such an important role in the establishment of many of these bird species. So if you've got all these wetland, inland lakes, all these birds that are coming in, they are largely going to be feeding on many of these bugs. And these things, the bugs, they can arrive with a variety of different means. Wind, of course, can happen, and animals coming up on like driftwood pieces. It's incredible the number of species that can exist on just one single piece of driftwood. Some of our later arrivers would have come along with our birds as well. But in this picture, it's talking about the midges. So midges are a huge thing that exist in Iceland, and especially in certain areas. This is at Lake Mývatn, and so it's actually a video. Hopefully it'll play on the left-hand side. And this is the number of midges that existed. This is just in the corner of a restaurant, actually. But in Mývatn, it's impossible for you to keep the midges out. But these midges come in blooms, and they are feeding all of those birds. There are a number of species, or a number of studies that have been done about the like biomass that it contributes to the area, the nutrients that it contributes to the area, and they can literally track the success of bird colonies directly related to the successes of midges. And they are being impacted by things like climate change, because the midges have two separate blooms that will happen in the summer, one kind of early summer and one in the later summer. So they're not there all summer long, I promise. But when we've got, later freeze events or unpredictable weather, it can actually crash entire populations of midges, which have in certain years have led to extremely low breeding success rate in our birds. So the bugs play such an important role in the ecosystem of Iceland. And yes, I'll show you this picture of midges swarming us while we're horseback riding, and show you the video of the midges in the corner of the restaurant there. But the other thing that you have to think about, and this is the benefit here, is that though they've been documented about 1,000 different species of insect on the island of Iceland. Mosquitoes is not one of them that has successfully established, which I think is really amazing, that we've got one species that is so well known for taking over everywhere, and somehow in Iceland they have not managed to do it. Sorry, Odin is coming in again. Yeah, they've not been able to establish there. There's cold, fluctuating temperatures. There's a lack of standing water habitat. The soil systems, everything, the whole ecosystem of Iceland is actually just not that hospitable to the introduction of mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes arrive. They do come there. Planes arrive, and mosquitoes will be on planes. They land in Iceland, and mosquitoes can try, but they've never actually been able to establish themselves there. So yes, these midges are annoying, but they're not coming around, and not these ones anyways, biting everywhere. They do like to go right into your eyeballs though, so they're a bit strange. But yeah, insects, it's a really, really important component to understanding how some other species have arrived and established themselves on Iceland. So if we've talked about the marine waters, we've talked about our birds and our insects, we got to talk about our mammals. So when we talk about the mammals of Iceland, the Arctic fox is actually the only native land mammal to Iceland. Every other land mammal that exists on Iceland, of which there are not tons of them, but every other one has been introduced by people. So how did the Arctic fox get there? And this likely, again, would have come about with the Ice Age. And so on the right-hand side, we can see that it's the maximum extent of the Ice Age, and it creates a massive area of ice that essentially connects various different land masses. So at the time, our sea ice would have been connected to an area such as Greenland. And so it's believed that our Arctic foxes just hopped on the ice, kept on walking, and then eventually made their way over to Iceland. And that is where they have established. So again, on the right-hand side in the red circle, that is where Iceland is. So it can really tell you how that sea ice is connecting the various habitat. And Arctic foxes are really well known for their travel. There are some Arctic foxes that travel a very small distance in their life. Others will cover an incredible amount of ground in just a short period of time. So this on the left-hand side of the screen here actually shows the travels of a single Arctic fox. So there was a young Arctic fox female that was collared in Norway, and then they watched her movement. And you can see March 26, 2018, starts in Norway, comes all the way across, and she would have largely been using the ice floes, so hopping on some ice and moving her way over to Greenland, and then over into northern Canada. So look at that time frame, March 26th to July 1st. In a very, very short time frame, moves over 3,500 kilometers. I think that equates to about 2,700 miles. So these animals are really well known for traveling large distances. This collared fox is not the only example that we have of a fox covering this incredible amount of distance. And sometimes they'll do it in short periods, and sometimes it'll be over a long period of time, over several months. They move around in habitat. They're exploiting the habitat. I work up in Churchill, and we talk about our Arctic foxes there and how some of them will leave the land area, go out on the ice, and follow around our polar bears. And the polar bears are out there, they're hauling out seals, they're catching seals, they'll eat, and then they leave bits and pieces, and the Arctic foxes run around on the ice, actually capitalizing on it. And if you've seen an Arctic fox in real life, they are actually very small, kind of the size of a larger domestic house cat, but they're pretty small. You've seen Odin come on here, and they're just a little bit bigger than what he would be. So it's pretty mind blowing that this small creature is able to cover this much land and live in such a harsh habitat. They have really, really dense fur. That fur has been able to, or has enabled them to live in habitats where sometimes we're experiencing wind chills of minus 94 Fahrenheit. Like, think about how cold that is. They also have fur that changes color, so that gives them another advantage of living in this habitat. So we've got kind of this darker brown fur that will exist in the summertime. And yes, maybe it does not allow them to camouflage in this more grassy field, but in other areas, that will be the perfect camouflage for them. Versus in the winter time, we get them in this all white color, and that all white can help them blend in to the habitat when it's covered in snow. Iceland is actually pretty unique in that not all of the Arctic foxes will change color. And that's because not all of the land of Iceland gets covered in snow predictably every single year for lengthy periods of time. So I think it's only about 1/3 of the population of Iceland's Arctic foxes will change to a white color in the wintertime. And that'll be the ones that are living kind of more in the center part of Iceland versus the Arctic foxes that are living along the coastal habitats. They will remain more in this brown, dark gray coloring because it allows them to blend into all of those coastal rocky areas. Another thing that enables them to thrive in an environment like Iceland and various other cold habitats is something called countercurrent heat exchange, and it's the way that their blood flows throughout their body. And so for us, our veins and our arteries are spaced out enough so that when warm blood leaves my heart, goes out to my extremities to warm my hands, it carries with it that heat, that colder blood then returns to my heart, gets warmed up, and they repeat the process. With Arctic foxes, among with many other species that live in these cold habitats, their veins and their arteries are very close together. And what that means is that when warm blood from their heart goes out, instead of the heat actually reaching out to the extremities, the heat is transferred back in and stays in their core. So they're not sending all of this heat out to their appendages. And their appendages, they can maintain at a much colder temperature than their inner core, but their core needs to stay at that hot temperature. And because of that, they will have this dense fur, but they also have extra fat. So they'll have really like extra fat on their foot pads to help prevent frostbite from happening and allow their feet to function in these really cold temperatures. And lastly, we can talk about that bushy tail. In the wintertime, really, really thick. They wrap it around themselves and essentially acts like a scarf. They can bury their face in it, and it helps to keep them warm. So these are just some of the ways in which our Arctic foxes are adapted to live in this environment. And I know that some of my friends and colleagues, they've done entire webinars on Arctic foxes. So if you want to learn more about them, there's lots of resources for that. But yeah, then we get to a much closer time period of when people arrived. So when people were first coming in, landing on this land that is Iceland, deciding, which confuses many people, deciding that it would be a great place to set up shop and decide to live. When you look out on this habitat, there's not a lot there, and so then they would need to bring things with them to enable them to be able to thrive in this really, really harsh environment. So, of course, some of that would be things like sheep. So they would have put them on boats, brought them over with the people, and they're going to have to be very hardy, resilient animals, these sheep, able to survive the harsh winters, but also graze on really sparse vegetation. It is shocking to me driving around in some of the highland areas of Iceland, and it's mostly like, volcanic ash and sand and gravel. There looks like there is hardly any food. And yet there will be sheep running around because they're so good at living and existing in these areas with such little food availability. And our sheep really became a cornerstone of the economy of Iceland and still remain to be that as well. But they are providing wool, they provide meat, depending on the species, because at the same time as our Icelandic sheep come in, they did also introduce, there's goats, there's cows, there's pigs, there's chickens, all of that would have come. They're, of course, a lot less iconic than our Icelandic sheep. But yeah, all of these things coming in and producing meat, producing eggs, producing milk, all of that has really benefited and helped people establish on the island that is Iceland. Huge cultural significance as well. People come specifically for Icelandic wool from these sheep. But yeah, that's how our sheep would have come. And at a similar time frame is when our Icelandic horses would have arrived. And the Icelandic horses, same thing, put on boats, brought over. And this would have been really beneficial as a mode of transportation. Yes, there is horse meat that people would eat as well. And to an extent, some of that still exists in Iceland too. But this would have been, again, a very resilient and hardy thing. I think I've said those two words probably about 90 times and will continue to say them because our plants, our birds, our sheep, our foxes, our horses, everything that gets introduced here is going to have to be incredibly hardy and resilient. And over time, the breeding of that will just highlight those traits. And so with many of these species, when they've come over, they end up developing populations, and then that is the population that still exists in Iceland. They don't continue to bring sheep. They don't continue to bring horses. They are really specific about not importing all of those animals now because it helps to control zoonotic diseases. If you've got species that are continuing to come in, they can carry a whole host of diseases that can then infect the population. And instead, they've allowed generations over a few hundred years to breed, create these resilient and hardy species, and establish very specific species. So the Icelandic horse is pretty iconic. They're known for being very calm animals. They are typically shorter than what people often think of with horses. But pro tip, if you go to Iceland, don't call them ponies. They don't like when you do that. Icelanders will get very upset with you. They are horses. But yeah, very calm, smaller animal. And what's really fascinating about it is because of the zoonotic disease threat, our Icelandic horses that live on Iceland, if they are to leave Iceland, say to enter a show or a competition or just be bought, and Icelandic horses exist in various other places of the world, then once that horse leaves, it is never allowed to return to Iceland. They have very strict rules on that. And that is to control zoonotic diseases, but also to prevent, different breeding that might happen because it's such a specific breed. And some of what else that has produced is the gaits that exist in our horses. The Icelandic horse is known for having a special gait called the tolt, and it is a very rapid movement. So you're traveling very quickly, but it's very smooth. They've adapted the way that their feet are on the ground so that they'll always have one on the ground so that it is a very smooth ride instead of, when you're traveling really quickly, but there's a lot of movement happening when you're on a horse traveling fast. With the tolt, that won't exist. There are jokes about how you could carry a cup of tea or a mug of beer, and as that horse is going on a tolt, you would be able to hold that glass and you actually wouldn't spill any liquid out of it. So Icelanders are really proud of the work that they've done in creating this really amazing breed of horse. The other thing that that we've introduced here is our reindeer. So there are reindeer that exist in Iceland. They're all wild reindeer. Actually, the first time, this is such a funny story. The first time myself and a couple of the other guides, we were in Iceland, kind of scouting out trips and doing the work that goes into us guiding before we get there. We're driving along the road and we see these reindeer in a field, and it's in a fenced field. And we went, oh, I guess they're breeding, like they must be their own reindeer. So we saw them, thought it was cool, but kept on driving. And then we got to our hotel for the evening in the Highlands, and had told the owner, oh, well, we saw these reindeer today and they were in a field. And so they must be owned by someone. And then he just looked at us dumbfounded and he goes, there are no owned reindeer in Iceland. They are all wild. So we had no idea that we actually saw wild reindeer in Iceland. And obviously now, every time I see them, I stop and take lots of pictures, and I can appreciate that it's a really cool thing. But these would have been introduced to Iceland. And again, we can go back to that idea of needing to have strong, resilient, hardy species. And when we think about a reindeer and caribou, they are the same species, so I've put their Latin name on there, Rangifer tarandus. Caribou is typically what we call them in North America, versus reindeer is what we'll call them in Eurasia. There are differences, but it's not a webinar on reindeer either, reindeer and caribou, but essentially they are the same species. So many of the qualities that we would see in our caribou here in North America, like having these very large hooves, all of these qualities are helping them flourish in these cold environments. So we've got huge hooves that help kind of act like snowshoes. So when they're traveling in areas that are snow covered, they're able to stay more on top of the snow and have an easier time traveling in that habitat versus a species with very narrow footprint. So imagine walking in the snow with like a stiletto heel versus walking in the snow with a pair of snowshoes. So obviously that's going to be advantageous. They also have the countercurrent heat exchange that I talked about with the Arctic foxes, very insulating fur. They'll hold on to a lot of fat, efficient digestion. So that's going to be really important for them as well, with coming into an area and a habitat where there is little food that is available. The antlers that are coming in, so these are good for our males in that they are used to kind of fight over breeding rights for females. For our females, they can use them to help defend food resources in the wintertime. That long muzzle helps as they're breathing in. It gives them more surface area to warm the air as it gets into their body. So that muzzle there, even the way that the fur is developed on their muzzle. Vision adaptations also exist. Reindeer living in these very northern climates, they actually will have changes in eye color that happen in the summer versus in the winter. And it's all to do with how their muscles are formed and move around, and depending on how your pupils want to dilate and constrict. Obviously, in the winter time, when they're going through very, very dark periods, their eyeballs are going to spend a lot of time with their pupils completely open so that they can receive as much light, and it affects the muscles that are in the eye and thereby affects the color of their eye, which is really quite fascinating. But lots of adaptations for them to flourish. And they were introduced much later than our like horses and our cattle. They were actually brought over in the late 1700s. And when they were brought over, they were put into 4 different spots. So I've kind of put them on the map there. So different populations released in the north, kind of in some of our east fjords, along the Reykjanes Peninsula, and then in the Westman Islands. And when they arrived, despite the fact that they are a very hardy and resilient species, my favorite words, it was still a struggle for them living in this habitat, this new novel place, and many of the populations actually crashed. Diseases that were maybe brought with them over from Norway when they were brought over here, the harsh winters, all of these things, their populations crashed a lot. And another thing that impacted them was hunting, because people had brought these animals here and they brought them over for food. They thought, great, well, we'll just hunt them and we'll start eating them. But because the populations were struggling, they weren't reproducing successfully, the hunting also contributed to it. And 3 of the 4 populations actually completely crashed. And by the 19th 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, only one population still existed. So over in the East Fjords. And to this day, it is the only place where you can continue to see reindeer in Iceland. So when we are on our trips, we're always making sure that during the couple of days that we are spending in the East Fjords region, that we are keeping our eyes peeled for our reindeer, because once we exit that space, there are no more reindeer here. So yeah, just the one area is where they still exist. And hunting and tourism is still pretty prominent for them. There's a couple thousand, depending on the time of year, reindeer that exist in Iceland. And when we think about reindeer in Iceland, if you think about reindeer or caribou and other habitats, they all have predators. And here in Iceland, they don't have any predators. So hunting is an essential component to maintaining the population of reindeer, because without predators, their populations are going to boom. They will take away habitat from other species. They would make it difficult for things like other sheep and whatnot to establish on the island. So it is super important for hunting to continue to happen. And every year in Iceland, they have a hunting season, and this benefits them in many ways, because if people are wanting to go and hunt a reindeer in Iceland, if you decided to hop on a plane and you wanted to go do some reindeer hunting, you do have to hire a local guide. So there's a lot of contributions to the economy because of hunting. And then obviously tourism is something that is really important. People love to come to Iceland and find the reindeer as well. Wintertime, you can see them pretty easily. We go on our trips, we go to a town called Djúpivogur, and there people will talk about how in the winter there's just reindeer in their backyards. They're all over the place. So people come to see them. So it's been a pretty prominent feature. I think I'm almost getting towards, I'm trying to keep an eye on our timing, almost done, but we have to also talk about some of these accidental introductions that happened to Iceland. So some of them completely accidental. As these boats were coming over, these boats would carry things like mice and rats, and so they have been able to establish in certain areas. I will admit, I don't go around taking pictures of mice and rats, nor have I really seen very many that exist in Iceland. So some of them will exist. The mink on the right-hand side, those were purposefully brought into Iceland around the 1930s. They were brought in for fur farming, and then many of them escaped. And so now there is a population of mink that exist on the island, and this does wreak a lot of havoc with many things, our bird populations. Rabbits brought over as pets, and then they would have been released. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of introduction of animals that have not exactly gone the way that people had wanted it to. Then we can talk about the polar bear. This photo is not taken in Iceland. This one is from up in Churchill, but polar bears, people will ask about the establishment of polar bears. They're right near Greenland. They're up in the north. Why wouldn't we have polar bears that establish themselves coming on land in Iceland? But there are not. It does not exist. There are not polar bears that have come, established a population, that come on land throughout the summertime. It's just not a thing that happens. There are polar bears that do come on land occasionally. This is a thing that happens. And it actually happened this past summer. I was in Iceland in the West Fjords with my group, staying at one of or not staying, but we'd go out to a lodge for a day in the Hornstrandir Nature Reserve when it's so beautiful there. But we got a call when we were out. We were in the lodge, we were having lunch, and we got a call saying that there was a polar bear sighting across the fjord. And so we had to stay inside and wait for it to be confirmed, because polar bear sightings have been reported, and then it turns out that it's a sheep or a swan or something like that. So until it's confirmed, they want to take the safety regulations. And unfortunately, if a polar bear does come on land in Iceland, it is going to be shot. There is no re-release program, the funding that would have to exist for that, the skills that people on Iceland would have to maintain for like the 1 in every 10 years a polar bear comes on land, to like sedate them and assess them and put them in a helicopter or however and transport them to other locations. It costs so much money, so it's just not something that they do. And unfortunately, on this day when I was there, it was actually a polar bear. And it was shot because they don't have the means of relocating them. They don't have the expertise of figuring all that out. The solution for when a polar bear comes on land, it will be shot. This also has to do with the introduction of zoonotic diseases. We don't want to have zoonotic diseases brought to the land of Iceland. So polar bears, we talk about them, but they're not really a thing in Iceland. Uh, I'm rapidly running out of time, but I just wanted to talk about one more thing, and that's this island called Surtsey. And so Surtsey is a newer island. It's some of the newest, well, one of the newer islands there. Might have some other volcanic activity producing islands in the coming time when we look at where all the earthquakes are happening in Iceland. But Surtsey is in the West Fjords, so this would have been close to the area where one of the reindeer populations was introduced, kind of on the southern part of that. Um, not West Fjords, not Westman Islands, what I was trying to call them. Yeah, southern part of the area of Iceland. But Surtsey, there was a volcanic eruption that happened in the ocean, and it started in November of 1963, ended in June of 1967, and it produced this wonderful little island. And so this island is actually a way that people have studied the colonization of species. It's close to the island of mainland Iceland, but it's not a place where people go. There is a research station that's on there, but I don't go to Surtsey. You won't go to Surtsey. Only researchers go to Surtsey because they want to study specifically how things are being colonized. It is declared as a nature reserve. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of all of these features. And so they've tracked over time the introduction of our lichens, our mosses, our vascular plants, our birds. When did seals start hauling out onto this island? And when would we start to see like all this marine life kind of establishing in these coastal regions? Yeah, it's been a really incredible way to study the colonization of an island over a short time frame. Because it's close to Iceland, yes, it means that this will be happening much more rapidly than it would have happened in Iceland as a whole. Species can just fly pretty quickly over to the land of Surtsey, and it was a pretty quick progression that happened. There were insects or plants, birds, some things that had started visiting the area and establishing themselves shortly thereafter, even when the eruption was still occurring. And so that's how rapidly it was able to establish. And they're really protective over this Surtsey Island. Like I said, only researchers going out, so protective that everything that researchers go out with, they must come back in with, including anything that comes out of them themselves. They actually found at one point that there was a tomato plant growing on the island of Surtsey that likely would have happened when someone ate tomatoes and then seeds came out the other end, and they were able to establish themselves on Surtsey. And so they removed them, but because of that now, all fecal matter will also come out. So it's really cool. It's like a live action case study that's going on for people to study how colonization can happen. But I've left some time for questions. So yeah, that's kind of the end of that. It's an ongoing thing. We're still seeing what's going on with Iceland, and it's a really incredible place to go visit. So I'll turn it back over to Brooke and see if there are some questions.
Wow, Leanne, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for going through all of that. I feel like I don't know how you crammed all of that in just like 50 minutes. That was amazing. So
A lot.
every yeah, it was. Wow, that was incredible. Yeah, just island evolution right before our eyes. So everybody in your control panel, there is a questions field there. If you have any questions, we'll see how many we can get through in the time we have left, because we have had some great ones come in, and we'll continue forward as they roll in. So we do have lots of questions about Arctic foxes. So let's go back to them for a little while. So if
Cool.
they came over naturally, how would they have fed themselves? Did they just eat birds and insects, or what was their main food source that helped them get established?
Yeah, it's one of the things that's so cool about our Arctic foxes because they're so adaptive. adaptive, and depending on where they live, then they eat different things. So yeah, when I'm up in Churchill, we talk about them going after things like voles and mice, and they will go after birds as well. I won't deny that, but we'll talk more about kind of land mammals for many species. People who, if they've watched foxes hunt, especially under the snow cover, and they do that big jump and try to pounce through, they're going after these small mammals. But when you come to Iceland, before there's the establishment of these small mammal colonies, then yeah, they have to adapt the food that they're going to eat. So they do eat a lot of birds. It's a pretty controversial topic in Iceland because there are a lot of people who will hunt Arctic foxes. They'll talk about how Arctic foxes might predate upon sheep, especially during like the lambing season. So sometimes farmers will actually shoot the Arctic foxes. There are areas where it's essentially required for you to hunt these Arctic foxes. There are a lot of bird advocates that will want to control the population of Arctic foxes because otherwise they could come in and they could decimate bird colony populations, especially in the nesting time frame, which is when our birds come there. But yeah, they would have been eating, and they still do eat a lot of birds, eggs. But there is a lot of berries that exist in Iceland too. And so as some of those plants started to establish themselves, they'll capitalize on that. And one thing I find quite fascinating, I guide in a lot of cold regions, but when I look at the plants, including the berries that exist in Iceland and Greenland and northern Canada, even in the alpine regions of the mountains that I live in, they're all very similar, if not the same species. So these would be very hardy, resilient, my favorite words, plants as well. So they will come over and our Arctic foxes will eat anything and everything. They'll eat poop. They're not picky. So whatever's there, that's what they'll eat.
Yeah, that's a helpful trait to have when you're establishing on a pretty hardy, hard to
Yeah.
live on island. So that's really
Yeah.
good to have. Generalists definitely went out in that way. So staying on
Yes.
Arctic foxes, so you did mention that not all of them turn their fur color depending on the environmental trigger. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Could, like, let's say if one of these foxes that were in the areas that weren't white and they went to an island that or an area that was white, would they change too? Or like what is it that's triggering them to switch their
Mhm.
color?
Yeah. So from my understanding, if an individual Arctic fox lives in an area and they stay brown all year round, and then they happen to be in an area where there is a lot of snow, they're not going to then be like, oh, it's snowy here, let me change color. It will be based on individuals. And so this is just kind of a genetic trait that comes out over time. So if you have a whole population of Arctic foxes that live in Iceland, but they're living in the coastal regions, when you change color, if you were to change color to a white Arctic fox in the wintertime in an area where there's not a lot of snow, your success of hunting is going to decline. And so therefore your likely success of breeding is also going to decline. So it means that the trait of changing color just doesn't continue to persist within that population. Versus the species or the ones that stay brown, they're good at hunting, they're good at camouflaging into their environment, they can hide from predators depending on where it is. Not really Iceland in that example, but those ones will get food and therefore be more likely to breed. So it is a trait that evolves depending on like the pocket of where those species live. And there are anomalies to it too. When I'm up in Churchill, which is an area that gets covered in snow throughout the winter time, we will talk about Arctic foxes, and we'll often refer to something as a blue morph. And these blue morph Arctic foxes exist in Iceland in the wintertime when it's covered in snow, and they are that kind of gray color. So it's not like a hard, fast rule that if you live in snow, you're going to turn color. If you don't live in snow, you won't change the color. But it's just kind of how those genetics have persisted in those populations. And the way they change has to do with photoperiod as well. So it's like just triggered and something changes in their body. And because of the length of day, and it's actually an issue with climate change happening now, that the length of day, typically, historically, we would have seen like when the length of day gets to this extent, that means that winter should be here. We change our color. Now we're white. But because because we're seeing snowfall happening later and later and later as a result of climate change, our Arctic foxes and other species, our Arctic hare, our ptarmigan, all these other species that change color, the photo period is no longer exact with, not that it's exact all the time, but is no longer the same as when snowfall happens. So they've essentially become decoupled. And so what we see is that our Arctic foxes turn white when there's no snow. And it does present some challenges for them in terms of hiding successfully. And the same would be true with some of our other species that have to change color. But yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, that definitely did. Thanks for that. This is a very good question, a very observant question. Are there any reptiles or amphibians on Iceland?
No, no, there are no reptiles, no amphibians that exist in Iceland, which there are some species that probably could establish themselves. There are species of frogs that live, there's the wood frog that lives up in northern climates and areas where it does freeze. They are literally a species, we won't go on that tangent, but they're a species that freezes solid in the wintertime. So in theory, they probably could succeed, like exist in Iceland, but because a wood frog doesn't really hop on a plane and get there or hasn't hopped on a boat to get there, then they've just not established themselves. So no, there's no reptiles, no amphibians that exist in Iceland.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask you one more question. I know we're getting to the top of the hour here. I have lots of questions here asking if there are any trees on the island.
Hmm. Yeah, there are a lot of trees that exist in Iceland, less than have previously existed. When people first came over, they needed to build houses, and so they chopped down wood and they build structures, and they essentially got rid of most of the forests that live or that existed on Iceland. I'll admit I don't have the numbers fully in my head right now, but a whole bunch of the island actually used to be covered in trees. And because we chopped down all the trees, so people chopped down all the trees, I think it's something like maybe at 0.5 to 1% of the island is now covered in trees. But there are a lot of reforestation efforts that are happening. People are trying to establish trees. It'll help stabilize soil. There's a joke in Iceland that one of the biggest exports of Iceland is dirt, because the wind comes in and there's very little plants to stabilize soil. So wind comes in and it just carries soil with them everywhere. And so if we are able to introduce hardy, resilient trees, they're able to establish in these nutrient poor soils, and it could really help a lot of things in many capacities. You could do a webinar on that too, I think, as well. But yeah, there are trees. They're not very many. They want to introduce more, and then they're typically quite a bit shorter. They don't have these massive, massive tall trees that people will see in other areas. But yeah, trees, they exist.
Ah, great. Yeah, like I said, that answered several people's questions, so that was very helpful. Well, Leanne, I that will be the last question that we have today, so I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks everyone for attending. Hopefully my love of Iceland came through very nicely there. It's such a great country, or yeah, great country. So would recommend visiting, and maybe I'll see you out there on a trip. I've got a few of them I'm scheduled to do this summer, so I'm looking forward to getting back there. But yeah, hopefully it kind of gets your brain thinking about how plants and animals might establish, and even if you look at disturbances that happen in our world, if it's fires or avalanches and stuff, like how do ecosystems regenerate themselves after that? It's all a very fascinating topic to discuss. So thanks for joining in and listening and learning more about Iceland.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Leanne, for taking the time to present to us today. And I'd also like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.